The air in Aurelia was so thin and expensive, you could almost hear it hum. It was the sound of money, old and new, mingling over plates of food that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Julian Croft, a man whose name was synonymous with the cold, hard currency of global logistics, found the sound grating. He preferred the clean, binary silence of a server farm or the decisive roar of a cargo jet. Here, in this gilded cage of hushed conversations and clinking crystal, he felt like an exhibit. Julian Croft, the titan of industry. See him sip his obscenely priced mineral water. See the carefully constructed emptiness in his eyes. He adjusted the cuff of his bespoke suit, a nervous tic he'd never managed to conquer. Across the marble-top table, his son Leo was doing a far better job of blending in. At 16, Leo wore his inherited wealth with an ease Julian had never possessed. He was scrolling through something on his phone, his thumb moving with the lazy confidence of a boy who had never wanted for anything. "Leo," Julian said, his voice a low rumble that could quiet a boardroom, "put it away. We're having dinner." Leo sighed, the sound a theatrical gust of teenage martyrdom. "Dad, we're not having dinner. We're occupying a space while waiting for nutritionally balanced art to arrive. I'm just documenting the experience for my followers. They're fascinated by the feeding rituals of the obscenely wealthy." Julian's jaw tightened. He loved his son with a fierce, protective ache that was the only truly warm thing left in his life. But he did not always understand him. Leo was a product of the world Julian had built, yet he viewed it with the detached irony of an anthropologist studying a lost tribe. "Your mother would have enjoyed this," Julian said, a familiar, reflexive defense. It was a lie. His late wife, Catherine, would have tolerated it, just as she had tolerated his long hours, his emotional distance, and the ghost that lived in their sprawling penthouse. The ghost of a girl named Amelia. A waitress appeared at their table, a silent wraith in a crisp black uniform. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long hours and aching feet. Yet there was an undeniable grace to her, a stillness that set her apart from the frantic energy of the restaurant. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. Her hair was pulled back in a severe knot, emphasizing the fine, almost fragile bones of her face. She looked tired, but resilient. "Good evening. May I take your order, or would you like another moment?" Her voice was low and calm, a cool stream in the desert of Aurelia's pretense. Julian was about to dismiss her with a curt order when Leo looked up from his phone, his own eyes so like Catherine's, widening slightly. He wasn't looking at the waitress's face, but at her neck, at the delicate silver chain that rested against the hollow of her throat. From the chain hung a small, impossibly intricate pendant. It was a hummingbird, its wings caught mid-flutter, crafted from hammered silver. A tiny shard of sapphire formed its eye, catching the low light and glinting like a captured star. It was unique. It was beautiful, and Julian felt the air leave his lungs in a single silent punch. Leo's voice cut through the fog in Julian's mind. It was uncharacteristically hesitant, stripped of its usual irony. "Dad," he whispered, his gaze flicking from the waitress to his father. "That waitress, her necklace. It's the hummingbird, the one from Mom's old photo album, the picture of you and that other woman." Time did not stop. It shattered. The low hum of the restaurant became a deafening roar in Julian's ears. The carefully constructed walls he had spent 25 years building around his heart, walls of steel and stock options and emotional scar tissue, came crashing down. The world narrowed to that single point of light, that silver bird hanging around a stranger's neck. It was impossible, a coincidence, a cheap imitation of a design he thought had existed only for one person. His logical mind, the mind that had built an empire on calculated risks and brutal efficiency, scrambled for an explanation. But his heart, that foolish, fossilized organ he thought had died a quarter of a century ago, knew. The billionaire froze. His hand, which had been resting on his water glass, began to tremble. The mask of detached control, his armor against the world, was gone. In its place was the face of a young man on a windswept beach, placing that very same pendant around the neck of a girl with laughter in her eyes and the future in her smile. A girl named Amelia, the ghost who had never really left. The waitress, whose name he didn't know, saw the change in him. A flicker of concern crossed her tired features. "Sir, are you all right?" Julian couldn't answer. The name Amelia was a scream in his mind, a name he hadn't allowed himself to speak in decades. The photo Leo mentioned was buried in the back of a safe, in a box marked "Personal Effects," a relic from a life he'd lived before he was Julian Croft, the Titan. A life when he was just Julian, a boy with nothing to his name but a scholarship, a beat-up car, and a love so profound it had nearly unmade him. "It's nothing," he finally managed to say, his voice a raw, unfamiliar rasp. The words were a lie, perhaps the biggest lie he'd ever told. He tore his eyes away from the pendant, a physical act of will that felt like ripping skin. He looked at Leo, whose face was a mixture of confusion and alarm. "You're mistaken, Leo. It's just a similar design." "No, it's not," Leo insisted, his teenage obstinacy kicking in. "I remember. The wing is bent, just a little, at the tip, and the sapphire eye. Mom said you told her the story, that you bought it from an old man at a seaside market, that it was one of a kind." The waitress took an involuntary step back, her hand rising to touch the pendant in a protective gesture. She was caught in the crossfire of a family drama she couldn't possibly understand. I'm sorry if this is a problem," she said, her professional calm wavering. "Is there something I can do?" Julian needed to regain control. He was Arthur Blackwood, a man who moved markets, not a sentimental fool paralyzed by a piece of jewelry. He straightened his tie, a gesture to reset his world. "My apologies, miss. My son has a vivid imagination. We are ready to order." His voice was clipped, cold, a dismissal. He ordered the most expensive items on the menu without looking at them, a brute force attempt to reassert his dominance over the situation. But as the waitress, Ilara, her name tag read, jotted down their order, her head bowed, he couldn't stop his eyes from being drawn back to the hummingbird. Amelia's hummingbird. He had given it to her on their one-year anniversary. They were 19, living on instant noodles and dreams. He'd saved for 6 months working extra shifts at the university library to buy it for her. It was a promise. No matter how fast the world moves, we'll find our way back to each other. A promise she had broken when she disappeared from his life without a word, leaving nothing but a cryptic note and a chasm in his soul. He had believed she left him for someone better, someone with more to offer than a silver pendant and a future built on potential. The betrayal had been the furnace in which the Julian Croft of today had been forged, hard, unforgiving, and deeply cynical. He had built his empire as a monument to that rejection, a silent, glittering, "I told you so," to a woman who would never see it. Ilara returned with their appetizers, placing them on the table with quiet efficiency. She avoided his gaze, clearly unnerved by the earlier exchange. As she leaned forward, the pendant swung free, and for a heart-stopping second, it caught the light, a tiny silver ghost dancing in the space between them. The past wasn't just knocking at the door. It had kicked the door down and was sitting at his table, demanding a reckoning. He had to know. The desperate, foolish hope he thought he had long since killed began to stir in its grave. "The necklace," he said, the word dropping into the silence like a stone. "Where did you get it?" Ilara flinched, her eyes darting towards the restaurant manager, who was watching them from across the room. She was clearly uncomfortable, but something in Julian's raw, pleading tone must have reached her. "It was my mother's," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "It's the only thing I have left of her." Her mother's. The words hung in the air, thick with impossible implications. Amelia. His Amelia. Had she had a child? A daughter? The idea was a seismic shock, rearranging the entire landscape of his past. The narrative he had told himself for 25 years, of betrayal and abandonment, began to crack. He had to get out of there. He threw several $100 bills onto the table, far more than the meal would ever cost. "We're leaving," he announced, standing so abruptly that his chair scraped against the polished floor. "Dad, what's going on?" Leo asked, his face pale with confusion. Julian ignored him. He looked at Ilara, his carefully controlled world in freefall. "What was your mother's name?" he demanded, the question raw and urgent. She stared at him, a cornered animal caught in the headlights of his grief. Her name was Amelia, she whispered. Amelia Vance. Vance, her maiden name. Before she had vanished. It was true, it was all true. Julian felt a dizzying wave of vertigo, a chaotic mix of fury, grief, and a terrifying, unbidden joy. He had not been abandoned, he had been erased. And this young woman, this stranger with his Amelia's eyes, was the living, breathing proof. A daughter, his daughter, standing before him, serving him overpriced food in a world that should have been hers. The irony was a blade twisting in his gut. He turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving the money, the food, and his bewildered son behind, escaping into the cold night air that offered no escape at all. The silence in the back of the Bentley was a living entity, heavy and suffocating. Leo sat rigid on the opposite side of the plush leather interior, the city light sliding across his face, illuminating the fear and confusion in his eyes. Julian stared out the window, but he didn't see the gleaming towers of Manhattan. He saw a windswept beach, he saw a girl's laughing face, and he saw the glint of a silver hummingbird. Who was she? Leo finally asked, his voice small, stripped of its usual bravado. That woman in the picture, the one you were with before Mom. Julian flinched. He had curated his past for his son, presenting a heavily edited version of his life. A life that began, for all intents and purposes, the day he founded Croft Logistics. The chapters before that were locked away, deemed irrelevant. Now the vault had been blown wide open. Her name was Amelia, Julian said, the name feeling foreign on his tongue after so many years of silence. We were together, a long time ago. Before all of this, he gestured vaguely at the opulent car, the glittering city, the empire. What happened? She left. The old lie came easily, a well-worn groove in his memory, but it tasted like ash in his mouth. The waitress, Ilara, Amelia's daughter, his daughter, had changed everything. The story of abandonment was no longer a comfort, it was a cage. When they arrived back at the penthouse, a sterile sanctuary of glass and steel overlooking Central Park, Julian went straight to his study. Behind a false panel in the mahogany bookcase was a safe. He spun the dial, the clicks echoing in the silent room. Inside, beneath stacks of bearer bonds and property deeds, was a small, unassuming wooden box. He took it to his desk, his hands trembling as he lifted the lid. There it was, a single faded photograph, a much younger Julian, thin and wiry, with a wild mop of dark hair, and a grin that was all hope and no caution. His arm was around a girl with hair the color of autumn leaves and eyes that held the sea. Amelia. Around her neck, the silver hummingbird was a blur of light. Tucked beside the photo was the note she had left him, the paper brittle with age. Julian, it read, I can't do this. I'm not the person you think I am. You have a brilliant future ahead of you, and I will only hold you back. Please don't look for me. Forget me. Be happy. A. For 25 years, he had read those words as a coward's excuse, a selfish betrayal. Now he saw them through a different lens. What if it wasn't an excuse, but a sacrifice? What if someone had convinced her she was a liability? He needed answers, not speculation. His first instinct, the instinct of a man with limitless resources, was to unleash an army of lawyers and private investigators, to descend upon that poor girl's life and tear it apart for information. But a flicker of something, a memory of Amelia's fierce pride, her hatred of his own burgeoning ambition, stopped him. He couldn't approach this like a hostile takeover. This required a finesse he hadn't used in years. He picked up his phone and called the one man he trusted with the impossible. Elias Vance was not a typical private investigator. He was a former intelligence analyst, a ghost who moved through the digital and physical worlds with equal ease. He specialized in discretion and dealt only in facts. Elias, Julian said, his voice tight, I have a situation. He didn't give Elias the whole story. He couldn't bring himself to speak the words aloud yet. Instead, he gave him a name. Amelia Vance. She would have been around 44 years old now. She disappeared from New York City 25 years ago. I want to know everything that happened to her after that. I also need information on a young woman named Alara Miller, a waitress at Aurelia." He paused. "Be discreet, Elias. The girl, she is not to be alarmed." The next 48 hours were a form of exquisite torture. Julian moved through his life on autopilot, his body attending meetings and signing documents, while his mind was trapped in the past. He was haunted by ghosts, the ghost of the boy he had been, the ghost of the woman he had loved, and the ghost of the daughter he never knew he had. The first report from Elias arrived via a secure, encrypted email. It was concise, brutal, and it ripped Julian's world apart all over again. Subject: Amelia Vance. Last known address in NYC, shared apartment with Julian Croft, 1999. Records indicate a bus ticket purchased to Havenwood, Oregon, 2 days after her disappearance. Rented a small studio apartment in Havenwood. Worked odd jobs, primarily as a freelance illustrator and artist. Records show the birth of a female child, Alara Vance, on August 14, 2000. Father's name left blank on the birth certificate. Amelia Vance died on December 3, 2005. Age 29. Cause of death: complicated pneumonia, exacerbated by malnutrition. She had no health insurance. Julian read the last line 3 times. Died. Malnutrition. The words were clinical, antiseptic, but they painted a picture of horrifying struggle. His Amelia hadn't run off to a better life. She had run away to die, alone and in poverty, while he was closing his first multi-million-dollar deal. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, stealing his breath. The second part of the report detailed Alara's life. After her mother's death, 5-year-old Alara Vance was placed into the foster care system. Her name was mistakenly recorded as Miller due to a clerical error involving her foster family's name, and it stuck. She had been bounced between 3 different homes. Aging out of the system at 18, with nothing but a small box of her mother's belongings, which included the silver pendant and a few worn sketchbooks. She had put herself through 2 years of community college, studying art, before the money ran out. Now she worked double shifts at Aurelia to cover her rent and send what little she could to her last foster mother, who was ill. The report was a litany of hardship and quiet perseverance. She had inherited her mother's artistic talent and her fierce independence. She had also inherited a life of struggle that Julian could have prevented. But one question screamed from the pages of the report. Why? Why would Amelia leave? Why would she run away to suffer and die alone, pregnant with his child? The note she left him spoke of not holding him back. It sounded noble, but it didn't sound like the Amelia he knew. She was a fighter. Someone must have pushed her. Someone must have made her believe she was poison. His mind flashed back to that time. He was on the cusp of greatness, a scholarship student at Columbia, already being courted by powerful firms. He had been introduced to New York's high society by his then mentor, a man named Charles Davenport. The Davenports were old money, a dynasty of bankers and lawyers. Julian was their project, the brilliant boy from the wrong side of the tracks. He had dated their daughter Isabel for a while, a passionless, strategic relationship, before he met Amelia, a free-spirited art student who saw the boy, not the project. Charles had been disappointed, but it was his wife, Beatrice Davenport, the family's formidable matriarch, who had been openly hostile. She saw Amelia as a common distraction, a gold-digging nobody who would derail Julian's carefully planned ascent. He remembered her cutting remarks, her dismissive glances, her thinly veiled threats. He had dismissed her as a snob. What if she was more than that? What if she was a predator? "Elias," Julian said into the phone, his voice cold with a dawning, terrible suspicion. "I have a new name for you, Beatrice Davenport. I want to know if she had any contact with Amelia Vance 25 years ago. Check her financial records, her phone logs, anything. Dig deep. I want to know if she bought a bus ticket to Oregon." He didn't have to wait long. Elias was ruthlessly efficient. The follow-up report came less than a day later. There was no direct evidence of contact. Beatrice was too smart for that. But there was something else, a thread that, when pulled, unraveled everything. A large, anonymous donation had been made to a small, private women's clinic in Havenwood, Oregon, a week after Amelia arrived there. The clinic provided discreet services for young women in trouble. The donation had been routed through a series of shell corporations, but Elias's team of forensic accountants had traced it back to a charitable foundation, a foundation chaired by none other than Beatrice Davenport. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Beatrice hadn't just disapproved of Amelia, she had surgically removed her from his life. She must have confronted Amelia, fed her a torrent of poison, that she was ruining him, that she was a stain on his future. She must have offered her money, a way out, framing it as a noble sacrifice. And Amelia, fiercely proud and deeply in love, had believed her. She had accepted the help to get away, to give him the future Beatrice told her he deserved, never knowing she was carrying his child. The rage that filled Julian was a cold, pure, clarifying fire. It burned away the last 25 years of grief and guilt, leaving behind a single, diamond-hard purpose. Beatrice Davenport had not just stolen the love of his life. She had stolen his daughter. She had condemned Amelia to death and Alara to a life of struggle, and she had done it all with the bloodless smile of a society matriarch preserving the status quo. He looked at the photo of Amelia on his desk. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the smiling girl in the picture. "I'm so sorry I didn't see it. I didn't fight for you, but I will fight for her. I promise you." His plan began to form, not a corporate strategy of calculated aggression, but something far more personal. Beatrice Davenport moved in a world of appearances and reputation. He would not destroy her in a courtroom. He would destroy her in her own gilded cage, in front of the very people whose opinions she valued more than human life. The annual Davenport Foundation Charity Ball was in 2 weeks, held ironically in the Grand Ballroom of Aurelia. It was the centerpiece of the New York social calendar. It would be the stage for her ruin, and he knew just who his guest of honor would be. Julian knew he couldn't simply walk up to Alara and announce that he was her long-lost father. The revelation would be a detonation, and she deserved more than to have her life blown apart without warning. He needed to approach her carefully, to build a sliver of trust before delivering the earth-shattering truth. He needed a pretext. He returned to Aurelia a few evenings later, during the slow period before the dinner rush. He was alone this time, dressed in a simple dark sweater and trousers, an intentional departure from the armor of his usual suits. He took a small table in Alara's section, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. When she saw him, her expression became guarded. She approached the table, her posture stiff with professionalism. "Mr. Croft, good evening. Please call me Julian," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "And I owe you an apology for my behavior the other night. It was inexcusable." She seemed surprised by the apology. "It's all right. You were upset." "I was," he admitted. "That pendant, it holds a great deal of meaning for me. You said it was your mother's?" She nodded, her hand reflexively going to the silver hummingbird. "Yes, she was an artist. She made it herself." The lie hit Julian with the force of a physical blow. Amelia hadn't made it. He had given it to her. So why would she tell her daughter that? He quickly realized the painful truth. It was a way of giving Alara a legacy, of making sure her daughter knew she came from a creator, a maker of beautiful things, not just a woman who was alone. It was an act of love, a final piece of maternal myth-making. "An artist," Julian repeated, latching on to the detail. "I'm actually the benefactor of a grant for emerging artists. The Amelia Foundation. We provide funding for talented individuals who haven't had the opportunity for formal training." It was a lie, but it was one he could make true with a single phone call. He was creating the foundation in her mother's name. For her. Ilara's eyes widened, a flicker of hope warring with a lifetime of cynicism. "You're serious?" "Completely." He slid a newly printed business card across the table. It was simple, elegant, with the foundation's name and a private number. "I saw some of your sketches when you were taking my order the other night. You have a remarkable eye for detail. I'd like to see more of your work. The foundation is looking for its first recipient." She stared at the card as if it might bite her. This billionaire, this titan of industry, was not only apologizing, but was now offering her the one thing she had always dreamed of. A chance. It was too much. Too sudden. I, I don't know what to say, she stammered. Why would you do this for me? Let's just say I have a deep appreciation for art, he said, the partial truth a shield for the whole, and a desire to see talent nurtured. Over the next 2 weeks, Julian carefully constructed his stage. He made the Amelia Foundation a reality, endowing it with a fortune that would help hundreds of artists for decades to come. He arranged for Alara to be its first official beneficiary, a story that the press, always hungry for a feel-good narrative about a benevolent billionaire, eagerly consumed. He had her portfolio reviewed by top gallery owners, all of whom confirmed what he already knew. She had a rare, raw talent. She was her mother's daughter. He met with her several times under the guise of foundation business. He learned about her life, her quiet struggles, her fierce loyalty to her foster mother, her dreams of one day having her own gallery. With every conversation, the guilt inside him grew, but so did a profound sense of pride. This remarkable young woman had survived, had thrived against impossible odds. During one of their meetings, he steered the conversation back to the pendant. It's such a unique piece, he said, trying to sound casual. Is there a maker's mark on it? Anything on the back? Hesitantly, she unclasped it and handed it to him. His fingers trembled as he held the familiar weight of it in his palm. He turned it over. On the back, so small he had almost forgotten it was there, were 2 tiny intertwined letters he had asked the old silversmith to engrave. A and J. Amelia and Julian. He felt the last of his composure crack. He handed it back to her quickly, before she could see the tears welling in his eyes. He had all the proof he needed. Finally, the night of the Davenport charity ball arrived. Julian had arranged everything with meticulous precision. He'd sent Alara a stunning, simple, deep blue gown, a requirement for the foundation's representative, he'd explained, and a car to bring her to Aurelia. She had no idea who the hosts of the ball were. She was nervous and excited, believing this was her official debut as the Amelia Foundation's first artist. Julian watched her enter the grand ballroom, a place she normally served in, now a guest. She looked breathtaking, her natural grace shining through, a stark contrast to the lacquered, surgically enhanced women around her. She was a wildflower in a hothouse of genetically modified orchids. He saw Beatrice Davenport spot her from across the room. Beatrice, the queen of this gilded kingdom, stood resplendent in emeralds and silk. Her eyes narrowed as she saw Alara, first with confusion, then with a dawning horror of recognition. Alara had Amelia's eyes. Beatrice's polite social mask contorted into a sneer of pure venom. She began to move towards Alara, a shark sensing blood in the water. The show was about to begin. Beatrice Davenport glided through the crowd, a galleon in full sail, her wake a ripple of whispers and turned heads. Her smile was a weapon, sharp and cold. She stopped directly in front of Alara, her gaze sweeping over the younger woman in a blatant, dismissive appraisal. I don't believe we've been introduced, Beatrice said, her voice carrying across the immediate vicinity, dripping with manufactured sweetness. I'm Beatrice Davenport, the host of this evening's event. And you are? Alara Miller, Alara replied, her voice steady despite the older woman's intimidating presence. I'm here representing the Amelia Foundation. Beatrice's smile tightened. The Amelia Foundation. How quaint. Julian Croft's latest little pet project. Tell me, dear, what must one do to receive such generous patronage from a man like Mr. Croft? I imagine the competition is rather stiff. The implication was ugly and immediate. The air grew thick with unspoken slander. Alara's face flushed, a mixture of anger and humiliation. She was being painted as a gold digger, a courtesan, in front of New York's elite. I'm an artist, Alara said, her chin lifting. Mr. Croft saw my portfolio. An artist, Beatrice scoffed, letting the word hang in the air like an insult. How lovely. Well, I'm sure you'll find plenty of inspiration among our esteemed guests. Just try not to get your paint on the couture. She turned to the small circle of onlookers that had gathered, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. It's a shame, really. Some people will do anything to claw their way into a world where they simply don't belong. It was a masterclass in social assassination, delivered with the precision of a surgeon. Alara stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides. She was cornered, outmatched, and utterly alone. Years of being made to feel small, of being an outsider looking in, rushed back. For a moment her spirit seemed to shrink, ready to retreat, to flee. But then something shifted. Her artist's eye, the part of her that was always observing, always deconstructing the world into lines and colors and truths, took over. She wasn't just looking at Beatrice Davenport, the society queen. She was seeing her. She saw the faint tremor in her hand, the desperate tightness around her eyes, the way the heavy emerald necklace sat slightly askew, as if clasped in a hurry. She saw the fear beneath the fury, and then she remembered a detail from her research for a portraiture class. She had studied photos of prominent New York socialites, Beatrice Davenport among them. She remembered an article in Vanity Fair from years ago. The air in the grand ballroom crackled, the ambient hum of polite society replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a sound in itself. Beatrice Davenport, a woman sculpted from generations of privilege, seemed to shrink within her couture gown. The emeralds at her throat, once a symbol of unassailable power, now looked like a gaudy lie, a choker of green glass. Ilara's words, quiet yet devastatingly precise, had not been a shout but a scalpel, deftly cutting away the facade to expose the rot beneath. "My mother," Ilara said, her voice finding a new timbre, a resonance born of a lifetime of unheard truths finally given voice, "taught me to see things for what they are, not what they pretend to be. She taught me that true value isn't in what you own, but in what you create." She said some people build their lives on such brittle foundations of deceit that they must surround themselves with copies, with fakes, hoping the reflection will convince them they are real. Each word was a hammer blow against the fragile construct of Beatrice's world, the small, captive audience of socialites and billionaires who moments ago had been enjoying the sport of her casual cruelty, now looked at her with a new, horrifying clarity. They saw not a queen, but a fraud. It was into this tableau of shattered artifice that Julian Croft emerged, stepping from the deep shadows of a marble column like a wraith summoned by the invocation of his past. He had watched the entire exchange, his heart a painful, violent drum against his ribs. He had wanted to intervene, to shield this girl, his daughter, from the venom, but he had also needed to see her, to witness the steel he knew must lie within her. She was Amelia's child, and Amelia had been a fighter. He had not been disappointed. He moved to stand beside Ilara, his presence a tectonic shift in the room's gravitational field. He didn't touch her, not yet. The gesture felt too intimate, an unearned claim. Instead, he simply stood with her, a silent declaration of allegiance that roared louder than any accusation. His gaze fell upon Beatrice, and the ambient chill in the room dropped 10 degrees. "She has a remarkable eye, doesn't she, Beatrice?" Julian's voice was unnervingly calm, a low current of immense power. "An artist's perception for authenticity, a gift, I imagine, inherited directly from her mother." He paused, letting the words saturate the air, letting every person in the room feel their weight. "And while we're on the subject of authenticity, Beatrice, let us discuss the truth. Let's speak of a young, fiercely talented art student. Her name was Amelia Vance." A strangled sound escaped Beatrice's throat. Her face, already pale, became a bloodless mask of terror. I have no idea what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," Julian continued, his voice devoid of heat, which made it all the more terrifying. It was the voice he used to dismantle corporations, cold, methodical, and absolute. "You saw a 19-year-old girl, brilliant and full of life, and you saw not a person, but an obstacle, an unacceptable variable in the equation of my ascent, an ascent you believed your family was entitled to orchestrate. So you cornered her. You preyed on her love for me. You fed her a poison of lies, convincing her she was a weight that would drag me down, a stain on the future you had designed for me." He took a slow, deliberate step forward. The crowd instinctively recoiled, creating a wider circle, a coliseum for a slaughter. "You arranged her disappearance. You paid for her bus ticket to a place so far away, You thought I'd never find a trace. You gave her money not out of kindness, but as a transaction to purchase my future, framing it as a noble sacrifice on her part. But there was one variable you failed to account for, Beatrice. One detail you missed in your meticulous social engineering. She was pregnant with my child. He turned his head slightly, his gaze finally falling on Alara. She was staring at him, her beautiful face a canvas of disbelief, of dawning horror, of a world tilting off its axis. He saw the hummingbird pendant rise and fall with her ragged breasts. He returned his attention to Beatrice, his eyes burning with the cold fire of a quarter-century of misguided grief. "This is her, Beatrice," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing. "This is the legacy you tried to bury. Alara Vance, my daughter, the true heir, not to my fortune. That's just paper and numbers. She is the heir to a legacy of courage, talent, and integrity. Concepts I suspect are as foreign to you as the composition of that synthetic stone you wear." He gestured dismissively at her necklace. "So tell us, Beatrice, is that emerald the only priceless original you've replaced with a cheap imitation? What happened to the real one? Did you have to sell it to settle a debt? To fund a private clinic in Oregon? To pay for the silence and the secrets that have propped up your hollow life for 25 years? Beatrice Davenport stood utterly naked in the glare of 100 pairs of eyes. The whispers began, a rustle of silk and condemnation that grew into a roar. Her reputation, the only currency that had ever mattered to her, was incinerated. She opened her mouth, a silent, gasping motion, like a fish pulled from the water. Then with a final, shuddering sob of utter defeat, she turned and fled. The crowd parted for her, their faces a morbid tapestry of shock, pity, and the cruel, undeniable thrill of schadenfreude. The queen was deposed. The castle was falling. Julian's attention snapped back to Alara. The noise of the ballroom, the scandal, the ruin of Beatrice Davenport, it all vanished. The only thing that existed was his daughter, swaying on her feet, her eyes wide and bottomless, with a million unasked questions. The truth had not been a gentle revelation. It had been a bomb, and she was at ground zero. He saw the strength drain from her, replaced by a profound, overwhelming shock. He closed the distance between them in an instant, his hands reaching out to steady her, his touch both a trespass and a desperate anchor. "I know," he said, and the words were fractured, broken pieces of a regret so vast it had defined his entire adult life. "I know this is impossible, but it is the truth. Your mother, Amelia, Alara, you are my daughter. After all this time, I found you." The glittering ballroom, with its opulent decor and its stunned, gossiping occupants, dissolved into a meaningless blur. For the first time in their lives, a father and a daughter stood together. Two strangers, fused by a catastrophic history, blinded by the sudden, terrifying light of the truth, with no map for the impossible country that lay ahead. The journey from the ballroom to the silent, sterile expanse of Julian's penthouse was a descent into a shared state of shock. The back of the Bentley was a vacuum, the city's glittering lights sliding across the windows like memories of a world that no longer felt real. Alara sat pressed against the far door, her arms wrapped around herself, a small, solitary island in a sea of plush leather. Julian ached to speak, to explain, to apologize, but the words were a useless pile of rubble in his throat. What could he possibly say that could bridge the chasm of 25 years? When they stepped into the penthouse, the silence was even more profound. It was a cathedral of glass and steel built to house a ghost, and now a living one had come home. Alara stood in the center of the cavernous living room, dwarfed by the double-height ceilings and the panoramic views of a city that had, until tonight, been an indifferent backdrop to her struggles. She looked at the cold, abstract paintings on the walls, the minimalist furniture, the palpable emptiness of the space. "This is where you live," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, spoken with the dazed wonder of an archaeologist discovering a lost, sterile civilization. "Yes," Julian managed. Your room is this way." The word "your" felt alien on his tongue. He led her to the guest wing, a suite of rooms larger than her entire apartment building. Everything was perfect, impersonal, and untouched. A five-star hotel room for a soul. She walked to the immense window and stared down at the river of headlights on the street below. She used to draw the city from our window, Alara said, her voice a murmur against the glass. It wasn't like this. It was a fifth-floor walk-up in Havenwood. The view was mostly of a brick wall and a fire escape, but she found beauty in the geometry of it, in the single weed growing out of a crack in the mortar. She turned to face him, her eyes clear and filled with a pain so deep it was almost calm. She never once spoke ill of you. She invented a sailor, a ghost, a romantic tragedy. It was kinder, I think, than the truth. The truth is a monstrosity, Julian admitted, his voice raw. One that I helped create. I was so blinded by ambition, so eager to prove myself, I never saw Beatrice for what she was. I let her poison my world. Amelia tried to protect me from it, and in doing so, she was consumed by it, and I was too stupid and too arrogant to ever question the note she left. It was easier to believe I'd been abandoned than to believe I'd been outmaneuvered. It fueled my entire life. I built this, he gestured vaguely at the opulent cage around them, on a foundation of anger and wounded pride. And all that time, you were out there. The admission hung between them, heavy and suffocating, the confession of a lifetime of failure. He left her then, sensing her desperate need for solitude. He retreated to his study, the room where he commanded his empire, and felt like a trespasser. He poured a whiskey, his hand trembling so violently that the liquor sloshed over the rim of the crystal glass. He didn't drink it. He just stared at it, seeing the fractured reflections of the man he was, the man he had been, and the father he had never known how to be. The next few days were a slow, agonizing navigation of a new reality. Leo, who had been left in a state of bewildered shock at the ball, was the first to attempt to build a bridge. He found Alara in the nascent art studio Julian had ordered to be immediately installed in a spare room, a space now filled with the scent of turpentine and fresh canvas. She was just standing there, surrounded by the finest art supplies money could buy, looking utterly lost. "So," Leo began, leaning against the doorframe with an awkwardness that stripped away his usual layer of irony. "This is officially the weirdest week of my life. And I once went to a birthday party for a Sheikh's cat." Ilara offered a small, watery smile. "Sorry to have upended your feline social calendar." "Don't be," Leo said, stepping inside. He looked around at the easels and boxes of paints. "My dad, he's not good at this part, the human part. He's fluent in logistics and quarterly reports. Emotions are like a foreign language he never bothered to learn. He just tries to buy the phrase book." He gestured to the studio. "This is the phrase book." "He's trying," Ilara said softly. "Yeah, he is." Leo picked up a stick of charcoal, weighing it in his hand. "You know, for my entire life, this whole place has felt like a museum, a monument to my dad's success and to a ghost. My mom, Catherine, she was a good person, kind, but she was sad, always. I used to think it was just her, but now, I think she was living with two ghosts, her own and Amelia's." He looked at Ilara, his eyes serious. "I'm glad you're here. The place already feels less like a tomb." It was a clumsy, heartfelt offering, and it was the first crack of light in Alara's suffocating new world. She and Leo began to talk, forging a strange and tentative siblinghood in the quiet corners of the penthouse, bonded by the shared experience of having Julian Croft for a father. The legal mechanisms churned on, cold and impersonal. A DNA sample was taken by a discreet doctor, the results delivered in a sealed envelope that Julian stared at for an hour before opening. The confirmation, 99.199% probability of paternity, felt both redundant and earth-shatteringly profound. Lawyers drafted documents. Her name was legally changed to Alara Vance Croft. Trust funds were established. She was, on paper, one of the wealthiest young women in the country. The transition was so swift and overwhelming, she felt like she was watching a movie about someone else's life. A week after the ball, Julian found her in the study, staring at a silver-frame photograph on his desk. It was of him and his late wife, Catherine, with a young Leo. She was beautiful, Elara said without turning around. Yes, Julian said, his voice quiet. She was, and she was a good woman who deserved a better husband than I was to her. He came to stand beside her. I loved her, but I was never whole. A part of me died when your mother left, and I never got it back. I gave Catherine a life of comfort and security, but I could never give her the part of my heart that was buried with Amelia. It wasn't fair to her. It's one of my many regrets. This, more than the money or the penthouse, felt like a true offering, a piece of his broken, complicated truth. He opened the safe behind the bookcase and took out the small wooden box. He placed it on the desk and opened the lid. Inside lay the faded photograph of him and Amelia on the beach, in the brittle yellowed note. Elara picked up the photograph, her fingers tracing the laughing face of the mother she had barely known. This is all I had of her too, she whispered. A box of photos and sketches. I want to take you somewhere, Julian said. The next day, his private jet, another obscene symbol of a life she couldn't comprehend, flew them to a small municipal airport in Oregon. A hired car drove them through the familiar, rain-slicked streets of Havenwood. They didn't speak. The landscape was a testament to the life of struggle she had endured, a world away from the one he had inhabited. He saw the peeling paint on the buildings, the shuttered storefronts, the quiet desperation he had been insulated from for decades. The guilt was a physical thing, a crushing weight in his chest. He led her to the cemetery, to the simple, weathered headstone. Amelia Vance, beloved mother, brilliant artist. Elara knelt, her hand resting on the cool stone. I used to come here and talk to her, she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. I would tell her about my day, my frustrations at work, my dream of going to a real art school. I'd ask her for advice. I always imagined she was listening. Julian knelt beside her, the expensive fabric of his trousers soaking up the damp earth. He didn't care. For the first time, he felt grounded. She told you I was a sailor, he began, his voice cracking. It was our joke. I was studying global trade and shipping logistics. I used to tell her that one day I'd have a fleet of ships that would sail every ocean on Earth. She would laugh and call me her ambitious sailor boy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone he had picked up from the beach near their old apartment that morning. He placed it on top of the headstone. I'm sorry, Amelia, he whispered to the stone. I'm sorry I never came home. I got lost at sea. He looked at Elara, whose face was wet with tears. It wasn't your fault, she said, echoing the words she'd spoken in his dream of this moment, but this time they were real. She made a choice to protect you, and Beatrice. Beatrice is the one who built the prison. You were both just living in it. It was an act of grace so profound it undid him. Julian Croft, the titan of industry who had not shed a tear in 25 years, wept. He wept for the boy he had been, for the girl he had lost, for the daughter he had failed, and for the hollow, gilded years in between. And in that shared moment of grief, on the damp ground of a small-town cemetery, the first fragile roots of a family began to take hold. Months bled into a new year. Elara did not magically transform into a socialite. She declined the invitations to galas and refused the couture wardrobes. She found her home in the studio, a space that now overflowed with her life. Canvases large and small were stacked against the walls, filled with her evolving vision of the world. She painted the hard lines of the city, but imbued them with the softness of her mother's memory. She painted portraits of Leo, capturing the thoughtful intelligence behind his ironic shield. She filled sketchbooks with drawings of the wind, the sea, the flight of birds. She was finding her voice, and it was powerful. Julian, in turn, began to change. He delegated more at the office. He started coming home for dinner. He would often just sit in the studio, watching her work, content in the quiet companionship. He told her stories of Amelia, her fierce arguments about politics, her love for bad coffee, the way she would hum off key when she was concentrating on a sketch. He was giving Elara back the mother she'd lost, and in doing so, he was finding Amelia again for himself. One evening, he walked into the studio to find her standing before her largest canvas yet, a triptych. It was nearly finished. The left panel was a dark, chaotic storm over a churning sea, a single silver hummingbird struggling against the wind. It was a depiction of loss, of struggle, of a promise nearly broken. The right panel was a stark, geometric cityscape of glass and steel, rendered in cold blues and grays. It was beautiful, but lifeless, a cage of success. A lone, shadowy figure stood at the highest window looking out, but it was the central panel that stole his breath. It was the beach from the old photograph, but reborn. The young man and woman were there, but they were not the focus. They were part of a larger composition. A young woman with her mother's eyes stood in the foreground, a sketchbook in her hand, looking not back at the couple but forward toward the viewer. And beside her stood an older man, his face etched with regret, but also with a new, quiet hope. The sky above them was clearing, and the silver hummingbird from the first panel was no longer struggling. It was soaring, its wings catching the first rays of a rising sun, flying a clear, straight path from the storm on the left, past the tower on the right, and into the heart of the new day they were all creating together. "It's our story," Ilara said simply, her voice soft. "The storm, the cage, and whatever this part is." Julian looked at the masterpiece she had created from their shared wreckage. He saw the pain, the grief, the regret, but he also saw the resilience, the grace, and the defiant hope. He saw his ambition and Amelia's artistry, not as opposing forces, but as two parts of a legacy that now lived in their daughter. Ilara had not just accepted her past, she had metabolized it, transforming it into something beautiful and true. He finally understood. He hadn't built his empire for nothing. All the power, all the wealth, all the cold, hard logic, it had all led him here, to this room. It had given him the resources to find her, to give her a sanctuary, to finally right a fraction of the wrong. His world of steel and concrete had become the foundation for her world of color and light. He walked over, and for the first time without hesitation, without the awkwardness of strangers, he put his arm around his daughter's shoulders. She leaned into him, a simple, trusting gesture that healed a wound 25 years deep. "This part," Julian said, his voice thick with an emotion he could finally name as joy, "is called coming home." The silver hummingbird, no longer a ghost of the past but a beacon for the future, had finally completed its impossible flight.